In 2077, China was voted the best country in the world. Main benefits, sky-high rate of happiness, and more people living obediently than anywhere else. China's come a long way to get here. Once a desperate rebel group in the southern mountains with no land to even call home, the rebels took advantage of the dying Qing Empire to fight for a better future. A future where the Chinese would not be ruled by an emperor and aristocrats, a future where they would be no longer victims of imperialism, and a future where China would guide Asia forward. Got quite a campaign for y'all today, so if you enjoy it, leave a like so others could see it too. So recently Kaiserreich updated, and the main focus of this update is a China unifier known as the left Kuomintang. They received a lot of extra content for the multiple stages they go through to unify China, and afterwards. Also, the name changed, so now it's known as the Mingan insurgency. The country has a very weird start, where you start as an exile nation and really can't do anything besides stare. Well, you can read some lore, but come on, reading in HOI4. But to sum up the lore, the German economy is not looking good, and with that economic crash, Puyi's China just can't take it anymore. Now we can actually play the game. With a small irregular army, we need to fight the other warlords in the former League of 8 Provinces territory for control. And fortunately for us, we start in a good position to immediately encircle some enemy units. Also, we finally have a proper focus tree to assist us in the war. Most likely, you won't need to finish this though, because the first war itself isn't too hard. There are decisions related to the insurgency's morale, and you can spend that morale for equipment and troops, and it's very easy to maintain a high morale while using those decisions, as long as you keep up the momentum. You also get 3rd International Volunteers plus Wang Jingwei himself with an elite infantry division. You may be wondering who Wang Jingwei is, and I say, don't worry about it. The real issue here is, despite being socialist, the 3rd International doesn't believe much in sharing, since they won't lend me any guns. The Nanjing clique has to fight a war on 2 fronts, so its AI struggles to allocate a good amount of units to stop me, allowing me to make constant breakthroughs. I keep trying to get a good encirclement going, but I just don't have enough units to secure a pocket. But during this offensive, I get an event whether to help with the next harvest, and I decide to be the good guy, despite it costing almost all my manpower. Why? Because what are we even fighting for if we aren't trying to help the people of China? It doesn't matter much because I finally got the pocket, and that eliminated all the foreign volunteers to Nanjing. They lost 9 divisions and 50,000 men, which was unrecoverable for a warlord like this. All that was left to do was race for the major cities and annex everything, leaving the Shandong clique with nothing, because the only thing they deserve to be is my next target. They knew they were cooked, so their last act as an independent state was to declare war on me. And I'd actually respect that if they were capable of fighting me for more than a week. Now there was a temporary halt to the fighting, and we could catch our breath. Our army had become better, but only slightly considering our opponents. The knowledge we gained was the equivalent of defeating a guy in a wheelchair by pushing his chair over. Although it wins me the fight, it doesn't really get me ready for the next boxing match. The economy is apparently in ruins from the war, but with only 6 factors right now, I'm just happy to finally have an economy that's capable of being ruined. The core on Jinling fixes the manpower problem at least, and we get to see the next part of the focus tree for the country. A Congress of the Kuomintang leadership meets to form the government of China, and it wouldn't be a proper leftist meetup if they didn't all split into different factions that now hate each other. So now I have to balance the power between Wang's camp, the Reorganized Comrades Association, and Song's camp, the Provincial Action Committee. Wang had established himself and his loyalists in charge, and Song's people were not happy. But there was also a wild card, the China Revival Society, composed of extremely radical young people who wanted a hyper-nationalist, totalist society. There are also other groups to think about, but if I can't remember them, then they weren't important. While the political bickering goes on, the Legation Council goes bankrupt, allowing us to liberate some coastal cities from imperialist occupation. Sadly, they still managed to keep some control over Shanghai and the surrounding area with the help of those other imperialist powers. Enough time passed that I thought I could continue uniting China, so the Yunnan clique seemed like a simple target. Some people wanted to rehabilitate old League generals to help us accomplish this, but why would I recruit the people I just beat to lead my army? Our army may still have a ways to go, but now that we have divisions with artillery, things are looking up and up for us. The only thing Hunan had going for it was its terrain and lack of supply infrastructure, but despite that, our brave soldiers marched in and secured the country. An actual challenge came to us with the Qing preparing a war against me. My guys were spread thin along the front line to fight, but so were they. But what I didn't realize until later was that they weren't the only problem. Sichuan was with them, and I had nothing to deal with their front. I thought maybe I could put enough pressure on the north and take all of that valuable land before the southern front became a problem, since the terrain there was a lot more favorable for me to push. I still needed something to at least slow down Sichuan, so I once again went around asking for guns, only to be denied, but at least Italy had my back. I put down 2 divisions on the Sichuan front and hoped that was enough of a bluff to stop the AI from attacking. After a lot of fighting, I weakened the Qing enough that the other warlords started to jump on them. Puyi was surrounded by enemies, and he didn't have the forces to stop us. I got a pretty significant pocket along the northern coast, and seeing me be successful inspired other oppressed nations to help me win as well. I was easily able to rush towards Beijing after this, and successfully captured the city before the rats in Fengsheng started moving south. I got an event congratulating me on the successful capture of Beijing, and it rewarded me with a terrible economy. Again, my army has somehow gotten worse at fighting, but I unlocked a new part of the focus tree to deal with those issues. With the end of the Qing, I thought all would be well. All I'd have to do was finish off Sichuan and things would chill out for a bit. But since I was now at the top, I made myself the next target. I finished off Sichuan pretty fast, but I had very little time to train more troops until someone else decided to jump on me. Eventually, I was completely surrounded by enemies. And I may have a better quality army, but the enemies have so many troops, I can't hold them all back. So France, the only socialist nation in China, is under attack from all sides by reactionaries. What are we gonna do about that?
We? We.
So Wang is all by himself, but he's smart enough to know that if he can pick his battles right, he can defeat the inferior reactionary forces in small victories to eventually set the stage for a large play. With the capture of Beijing, things actually may be on the up and up for one.
I just can't do it. I can't take it no more, man.
Guess I gotta act fast and make a bold play then. Since the warlord in Shaanxi was the smallest, I just went for the kill on them. They could barely maintain a front line, allowing me to run behind them and seize their capital. And I felt something again. I felt hope that I could win this war. But then I looked at my front by Beijing and saw my front line was collapsing due to the Japanese reinforcements, and I wasn't delusional enough to believe I had a chance. I knew I couldn't do this alone, so I did something I wanted to avoid. I worked with the reactionaries since it was clear the Japanese were the greatest threat to China. Now that I freed up a bunch of troops, I could send them to reinforce the north and guard the coast against a naval invasion. And those coast guards arrived at just the right time since the Japanese were already trying to naval invade. They like to do this a lot because by the time I finished up cleaning up this first failed naval invasion, they were starting another one around Guangzhou, but I was in no hurry to help them here because they're not my ally. We just hate the same people. I had better things to focus on, like making counterattacks in the north. I had managed to encircle nearly an entire army of Japanese soldiers, including a medium tank. By the time that army was fully destroyed, the Japanese had lost 122,000 men from that. The Guangzhou invasion front was stabilized, and with the co-prosperity sphere weakened around Beijing, it was time to advance into Manchuria. By this time, my divisions were all veterans from over a year of straight fighting, so the Japanese and collaborator lines were easily broken. I got Beijing back, again, but this was very big because now I could actually do the part of my focus tree that allows me to fix my economy. Again, with Manchuria falling into our hands, things were looking really great for us. There were a lot of people who wanted to support our fight, but too bad I couldn't accept their help because of the Japanese blockade. Socialism would soon triumph in Manchuria, and Korea was left completely unguarded with that happening. The only thing left to do was clear the Japanese landing from around Guangzhou. While I was being successful in driving the imperialists out of China, the Western socialists were struggling a lot. You think with all those weapons they saved by not sharing with me, they would have put them to good use defeating the Germans, but no, they're dying to the Kaiser instead. In Hong Kong, the Japanese made their last stand on the Asian mainland, but with wave after wave of Chinese forces hitting them, they couldn't hold out very long. The Japanese lost 1.1 million men in their failed attempt to conquer us, and finally, they were ready for peace. Of course, I accepted this peace so I could get back to what was really important and unify China. I stopped pretending I liked the other warlords and set up to unify the land that is rightfully mine. Good thing that the Japanese invasion in Guangzhou had conveniently weakened Kunming's army, so taking all their territory was very easy for me. I just walked through all their major cities and announced their liberation. It was finally time to declare China united once again, but we still had a lot to do at this point. We had a lot of loose ends to wrap up. Also, while this was all happening, the radicalism in the party may have gotten a bit out of hand, and with us in control of all of China, we're starting to see the results of that. France soon fell to the Germans, but at least it wasn't over for the West yet because the Americans were joining to save the Third Internationale. I finished up saving McLeek, and when I was about to do the same for Xinjiang, they were smart enough to submit to me. And since I ignored the earlier advice of the game to keep radicalism below the popularity of the two main factions, things were continuing to get unstable. Radicals were coming out of the shadows to exercise their power, and the nation was gonna suffer from it. While the radicals were making their moves, Wang's opposition in the Provincial Action Committee had decided that just because Wang wanted to be a dictator, he was a threat to Chinese democracy and got support to impeach him. But they failed to remove him from office, allowing Wang to double down and secure his position even more. His opposition saw that democracy was dying and knew they had few options left, so they abandoned the capital. They established a new government in Fujian, declaring the current one illegitimate. In response, Wang went south, claiming he was going to talk them out of this, or raise support with radical militias to shut them up. People weren't sure, but whatever his true intentions, it didn't matter because he never made it there. So now we have a power vacuum with 4 contenders for the new leader of China. You can choose whether to play this with or without tooltips telling you who is winning and what the effects of events are. I am trying to get the Chinese Revival Society conspiracy, so that involves me declaring martial law and taking care of some pesky rebel armies that try to compete for power. And of course, in the middle of chaos, Xinjiang is getting second thoughts. But despite everything going on, the Chinese Revival Society manages to overcome the opposition, with Hu Zhongyan now taking charge of the country. Hu finished the conquest of Xinjiang and sought to secure other nations along China's border, like Tibet, but they had their independence guaranteed by Mongolia for some reason. Anyways, it was time to modernize the Chinese army further by making use of tanks and planes. Although they wouldn't be ready for the fight against Tibet and Mongolia, their ability to resist us wasn't much of concern. But what was a concern was the Third Internationale in Europe, where it's hard to tell who's winning due to the multiple invasions both in Britain and in mainland Europe. But my concern was soothed when it became clear that the Germans would be pushed out of Britain, and I thought to myself, since the East is thriving right now, maybe I could start helping out the West so they can start to win their war. Anyways, we were not done with Japan. They still controlled rightful Chinese territory and needed to be neutralized for good. We may not have a navy, but there are always other ways of landing in Japan. The remaining Japanese holdings in China could not stand up against the superior Chinese military. And with the fall of the final Japanese positions in Shanghai, I was in an awkward position of not being able to paradrop since I neglected to build fighters. Still, despite losing, the Japanese were eager to bring the fight to me with more naval invasions. They even managed to get some landings and I had to fight to push them out again. Although my war was stalling out, at least the West War was coming to an end. Obviously due to my military support. But by the time I'm pushing the Japanese back to the sea, the German Empire has completely collapsed and I get to reclaim the cities they stole from China long ago. Due to Japan's disastrous naval invasion campaigns, I had gotten the advantage needed to drop on their mainland, and since they lost so many troops in China, they barely had anything to stop the paratroopers marching towards Tokyo. Once I liberated that city, I figured it was time to declare ourselves the protectors of Asia, and we had the option of inviting the Philippines to our alliance. But I guess despite them being socialists, they hadn't purged all their liberal influence since they refused our invite. Japan made a last-ditch attempt to save themselves by reinvading the south of their country, but that was not going to help them. We had too many troops in our country, and I could easily defeat them, forcing Japan to accept defeat again, and this time it cost another 2.2 million men. Anyways, it was time to expand our sphere of influence in the southeast. The remnants of the German Empire remained controlling Indochina and the East Indies, and they needed to be purged. The vast majority of the colonial army was in Vietnam, but with some well-placed paradrops, they could be completely isolated and rendered combat ineffective. The German East Asian colonies might have thought they could at least keep their capital safe from naval invasion since they maintained a substantial navy, but that thought evaporated when they saw the repossessed Japanese fleet flying a Chinese flag. China had gone from a nation with barely a cruiser to its name to one of the top naval powers in the world, and the Germans could only watch in horror as the finest ships in their fleet were sunk by people who've only been on the ocean for a few months. With these victories, who could confidently declare the century of humiliation was ending, and the new state would make China the great power it should be at the sacrifice of your personal freedom, wealth, and identity. And I guess people don't like that since my stability gets completely nuked by doing this. So after that focus finishes, we went from 100 stability to 4. I guess people really aren't feeling this ideology, but they'll learn. Eventually. However, instead of naval invading Malaya, I realized I could just paradrop, since I have just enough range for my transports. But can you imagine being this poor colonial border guard? 1 minute you're just chilling, and then the next minute 100,000 Chinese paratroopers land around you. Singapore falls shortly after this, and I get to proudly claim all of the East Indies as part of the new Sinosphere. And since the Philippines are still being so stubborn, I start preparing an argument for why they need to join. While that was happening, Siam was going to be the next member of the Sinosphere. And for some reason, there was a lot of hostility from the Siamese people toward us. But once I captured every important area of their country, they seemed to change their minds. The Dominion of India was the last major member of the Entente, so they needed to be eliminated to secure Asia from imperialist influence. Now, some may question the idea of driving tanks through thick jungles in Burma, but when you have 1,200 bombers overhead, clearing paths through the trees becomes very easy. Meanwhile, the arguments for the Philippines to join us were having their landing prepared in Luzon. The tanks in Burma truly proved their value when they were able to rush ahead and encircle an entire Indian army. When we convinced those troops to surrender, Indian losses ballooned to well over 1 million, 328,000 from that pocket alone. Going forward a bit, in the Philippines, we were greeted with little opposition, so it was clear that the Filipino government had refused our offer, acting against the will of their own people. As we reached the open plains of central India, they had no ability to resist us. The reactionary forces were quickly pacified one by one. And as we advanced to New Delhi, they couldn't even hold a cohesive front line against us, allowing us to send our mobile forces to major population centers, informing the locals of their liberation. The final pillar of the Entente had collapsed, and the entire subcontinent of India was going to be liberated under China's watchful eye. There were still some holdouts in the Himalayas, but it's not like they had the ability to refuse our protection. Australasia tried to survive as the last bastion of the Entente, but the Americans were making sure that dream was gonna die very soon. But at this point, I think we can consider imperialism in Asia defeated. The century of humiliation was over, and Asia remained safe from any possibility of foreign imperialism with Chinese protection. The sun never sets on socialism, since it dominates the entire world with the fall of both the Entente and Reichspakt, leaving Russia alone as the sole liberal power on Earth. So that's the end of this story, a bit longer than usual, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Anyways, I started a Patreon for those who want to support the channel. There you can become one of my alumni and have my eternal gratitude along with other perks. Also, if you guys didn't see, I tried something a bit different than my usual content and uploaded a game review for a new strategy/RTS game. And if you have the time, I'd really appreciate you giving that video a watch and leaving any feedback on it so I can do better. But that's it for me now. Expect more good stuff in the future, and hope to see you all another day.